Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Civil War Roundtable program. The Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League, the Legacy Foundation's mission is to create better, more informed citizen leaders. We do this through a host of programs throughout the year, including exhibits, lectures like tonight, scholarship programs. We gave over $300,000 to deserving scholars 2 weeks ago. We have a host of programs that, with regard to our art, and tonight actually is our 40th, I believe, our 40th virtual program we've done since April 1st, and it's reached thousands and thousands of members and others. So I want to thank all of the donors who make all of this possible. We could not do any of this without our donors. One of those donors is a good friend of mine by the name of Bob Andrews. Bob is a railroad enthusiast, a Union League member, a former member of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation Board, and it's actually, I think, at his suggestion that we have this program tonight. Bob was a member of the old Affinity Club. Some of you may remember the Railroad Club of the Union League. And for reasons that are unclear to both Bob and to me, that went out of existence a few years ago, and Bob would like to resurrect it. So his idea is to have events and lectures and tours and trips, all regarding railroads. So if you are interested, we're going to share Bob's email address on the chat function, I believe. That'll be there, and we'll also email it to everyone tonight. If you're interested, a Union League member interested in joining this affinity club, contact Bob, and I hope you are successful. So tonight we will have a Q&A function, and that is located at the bottom of your screen. So at any time during the program, feel free to ask questions on that, and we will get to as many of those questions towards the end of the program as we can. And now to introduce the program is the historian of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
Hey, there we go. Hope that unmute worked. Hey, John, thank you very much. And welcome everybody to another, it's gonna be a really fun program. In all the years we've been doing Civil War roundtables, apparently we've never done one on railroads. So now we're making up for lost time. So it is our pleasure to be here this evening then with our special guest, Bernard Kempinski. Now, Bernard has had two lives. His current one is as a journalist, author, freelance author, and book publisher, mostly about railroads and model railroading, because that's what Bernie does right now. And behind him, you will see a door, and that is a door to his Civil War era model railroad layout. So maybe we can all get Bob to put a trip together and go down to see the layout in Alexandria, Virginia, where Bernie is right now. In Bernie's previous life, though, he was a captain of the U.S. Army for 24 years working on defense contracting. He was the armor guy, apparently, from what I understand. And then when he was finished with the Army, he went over to Congress and worked in, I guess, the Office of Management and Budget. So, but obviously he's a pencil pusher one way or the other. So but I think this is going to be a really fun program. So Bernie Kempinski, thank you for being with us tonight. We're looking forward to your program, and it's off to you now.
Okay, thank you and welcome everybody. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my favorite hobby. And we're going to get started. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, here we go. So tonight I will be talking about an introduction to the railroads of the Civil War. And I'm not a professional historian. I approached this from my hobby. And as a result, I would like to show you, just to get started, a quick little video clip of my railroad. And again, I'm not a professional historian. I approached this subject as a modeler interested in the Civil War, but I kept digging deeper and deeper into it and ended up learning a lot and ended up writing a book about railroads, not just of the Civil War, but of the military. One of the nice things about a model railroad is we get to see what railroads look like in color, because almost all the pictures we have, there are a few paintings, are in black and white. So let's start this talk with this quote. This was in Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, and he was describing his first train trip from the Midwest to West Point. And that was around 1830. In the 30 years from when Grant took his train ride until the start of the Civil War, the railroads did undergo quite a bit of development, but they were still a juvenile industry. And so you, as a modern observer, could look at a railroad of the Civil War and recognize the various features of it. There were locomotives and track and such. But everything was different, and even the way people dressed was different. And sometimes when I do this speech, I wear my military uniform to show that people were a lot more formal back then and wore a lot more clothing than we do now. So with that little intro, let's take a look at the outline that I'll be talking about tonight. First thing we'll do is a little review of the situation at the start of the war, and then we'll get into the part that the railroads played. We'll look at the logistics, some of the equipment that they use, and the infrastructure, and mostly with how it compares to now. And then we'll discuss some operations. And then if we have time, I'll show you a few more photos of my model project. So at the start of the war, or I should say before the war, Sherman was alleged to have said this. Now, you won't find this in Sherman's memoirs, but he is alleged to have said this. And if you read it, you will realize that he is predicting the outcome of the war. And it's amazing how correct he was. And so what was he talking about? Let's take a look at the situation. All right, so this infographic shows roughly the population, the industrial output, the gross national product, and then some examples of locomotive production. You know, people ask me, well, if the Union had all these advantages, why did the war take so long? Well, let's look at Valverde, New Mexico, which is over by El Paso, to the distance to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That distance is the same distance as from Paris to Moscow. So we're looking at a war that is a continental scope. And it is a war that the North is going to have to invade to bring these southern states back to the Union. Now, at the start of the war, the North had about twice as many people as the South, a little bit more than that. But 40% of the South's population were slaves, and they were not eligible for military service. So the manpower for military service was actually a 4-to-1 advantage to the North. And you can see in that little infographic that 2.1 million Union soldiers fought for the North and about 1.1 million for the South. Also, we should remember that approximately 200 to 300,000 African Americans joined the Northern Army and further exacerbated the North's manpower advantage. If you look at the gross national product of the United States, and these are in then-year dollars, it was only $4 billion, but $3 billion of that was in the North. And if you look at industrial output, you see that it was $1.5 billion, which the North had 10 times the South. But that leaves $2 billion or so of the North's economy in agrarian products. And so even though people say the North was a heavily industrialized society, it was still mostly agrarian. And in fact, during the Civil War, there was a grain boom going on in the Midwest and a grain shortage in Europe. And therefore, the northern railroads were very busy shipping grain to Europe. So if you look at the B&O Railroad, for example, they only had 30% military cargo. The rest of it was civilian cargo. The further you went north, the lower the percentage of military cargo until you get to the New York Central predecessor railroads, who were only shipping about 2% military cargo during the war. That means 98% of their cargo was regular civilian traffic. Now, in terms of industrial output, in 1860, the South produced 19 locomotives at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. On the other hand, the North produced 451 locomotives, and the North kept up that rate of production for the rest of the war. In fact, the production rate went up. The South, on the other hand, made 0 locomotives during the rest of the war. They had the capability to do it, but they only had 2 or 3 ironworks that could produce the parts needed. And those ironworks were prioritized to do other projects, mostly artillery and armor. So the South produced 0 locomotives, and with the blockade, they were unable to import any locomotives. So the only way they could get new locomotives was either capture them from the North or try to repair the old ones that they had. Now, in terms of railroad trackage, the North had about 21,000 miles, the South had 9,000 miles, which is a respectable number. That would be equal to just about the mileage of any European country at that time. But during the war, the North added 5,000 more miles of track to their system, while the end of the war, the South was down to 25% of their total output. The South had no capability to re-roll rail during the war. I mean, again, they could have, but their mills were busy doing other things. And so you can see, here's the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond after the fire that destroyed part of it. That was the main ironworks in the Confederacy. On the other hand, the North had ironworks scattered all over the North. Back then, ironworks were not concentrated like they are now in Pittsburgh and in Chicago. There were ironworks in New Jersey and in New York, a few in Massachusetts. Wherever you had one of the ingredients, there an ironworks would pop up. This slide shows some examples of what I call the overwhelming industrial might that the North had. So at the bottom, talking about iron, those are spare rail stockpiled in Alexandria, Virginia, just in case they need them. Whereas the South had no ability to make new rail, the North had stockpiles of it laying around. In the upper left, you see prefabricated bridges being assembled in Virginia. These were bridges, or these pieces would be used to repair bridges that were destroyed. The North got so good at repairing bridges and allegedly tunnels that at one point, when Confederate raiders destroyed one of the tunnels on the Western Atlantic supporting Sherman, when the word got back to the Southern soldiers, one of them is supposedly to say, well, there's no problem there. Sherman's probably got a spare tunnel. They just got so good at repairing them that it didn't really interfere with things. And in the upper right, you see artillery being stored at City Point, Virginia in 1865, showing the vast reserves of weaponry that the North had. But more importantly, you see an African-American soldier guarding those weapons, which points out the fact that I made earlier that up to 300,000 African-Americans served in the Union Army in the Civil War. There were other differences between the North and the South that I like to lump in the philosophical or political category. And every one of them led to an advantage in Northern Railroad capability. For example, just the way the tracks were laid out gave the advantage to the North. And I'll show you this in a slide in the next second. But Southern railroads were developed to bring products from farms to the nearest port, whereas Northern railroads more had an interstate trunk line, and there were 4 lines across the Appalachians to bring Midwestern products to the East. And as I mentioned earlier, they're doing just that during the war. And this whole idea of laissez-faire and private ownership and the federal government shouldn't interfere, the South took that to heart. And so the Southern government never had a unified office to manage their railroads until 1 month before the surrender at Appomattox. Meanwhile, Northern railroads knew that if they did not cooperate with the federal government would take over. And so they did cooperate. And the government made it easy for them by paying the federal railroads either market or above market rates for military cargo, whereas the Southern railroads leaned on the patriotism of their owners and asked for below market rates and discounts. Now, railroad owners North and South were capitalists, and so they looked to make money. And so as early as 1862, you see Robert E. Lee writing letters to Richmond complaining about the inability of the RF&P Railroad to provide supplies for his men, and therefore he scatters his guys down to North Carolina and out into the Shenandoah Valley so they could forage. Now, one other thing happened in 1862, the federal government formed the United States Military Railroad. And this was an organization, it's the railroad that I actually model in my basement. It was an organization that only managed the railroads in the territories that the North were reconquering. So as the North moved into Tennessee or Virginia or North Carolina, the U.S. Military Railroad would run the Confederate railroads that were there. There was only one instance where the U.S. Military Railroad took over a northern railroad, and that was during the Gettysburg campaign, where they took over the Western Maryland Railroad to provide supplies to the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg and also to evacuate wounded. And that was Herman Haupt, who was a member of the Union League, who did all of that. And then this other point about interchange, which sounds very strange to anyone who's familiar with modern railroads, but railroad owners back then did not want to interchange their cars between competing railroads. Part of the problem was there was no standard gauge, but that wasn't the real problem. And the real problem is something that I like to say, that nothing changes in Washington. I worked in Washington for 10 years. I got to see how it works. And the more you read about the Civil War and the Revolution, you realize that very little has changed in American politics. And what am I talking about? Well, in this case, it's more at the state level, but the governments that wanted to charter railroads, but the hotel lobbies and the Teamster lobbies did not want railroads connecting in their towns without interchange. They wanted the people to get off trains, stay in their hotel, and then go over and use their Teamsters to move their cargo. And so as a result, when you see maps, you'll see that the railroad, and I'll cover this a little more in a little bit. So let's take a look at the effect that railroad had on transportation. And this is from a 1932 document, Historical Atlas or Historical Geography of the United States. As you can see, in 1800, it took a long time to get anywhere, especially if you had to go over mountains. By 1830, when Grant took his first train ride in the middle there, you can see that you were averaging about 12 miles an hour. New York to Philadelphia took about a day. That's about 150 miles. That's roughly a half day of travel at 12 miles an hour. By the time of the Civil War, though, you could get past Richmond in one day. However, to go to Richmond from New York in 1857, you had to take a train to Washington, get on a steamboat. Steamboat would go to Aquia Landing, and then you would get on a train and head the rest of the way. But notice also that as you get past where the railroads went, travel times got a lot greater. So here's the network at the start of the war. And everyone has heard that the reason the South lost the war is because they had different gauges. Well, if you look at this chart carefully, you realize that that's not true. The South was predominantly 5-foot gauge. Only in North Carolina and Virginia was the gauge standard 4 foot 8.5. And there were a few oddballs over in the West. And there's that key piece of narrow gauge railroad or standard gauge railroad from Montgomery toward Atlanta. But more importantly, and I'll show this in a minute, the railroads do not actually interconnect. So remember earlier when I said the South built railroads to the coast and they didn't have a transcontinental line? Well, if you look on this map, you'll see a line that goes from Richmond, Petersburg to Knoxville and to Chattanooga. So did I lie? No, I didn't lie. That's actually 4 different railroads that don't interconnect in the towns where they meet. Also, I'd like to point out that the South did put some new lines in. Those are shown as dotted lines. And by the way, this chart is in my book on military railroads if you ever want to examine it in more detail. Those dotted lines are lines that the Confederates built using rail that they pulled up from other lines that they weren't using. The line from Jacksonville to the southwest coast of Florida was not being used because that line was built to short circuit cargo from New Orleans to the north. And so they pulled that line up and used it elsewhere. I also want to point out the black lines are the lines that the U.S. military railroad managed during the war and then rebuilt after the war. So let's go back to this point about the rail-to-rail interchanges. This is a diagram of Richmond, and you can see that Richmond was well served by railroads at the start of the war. There are at least 4 railroads that went in there, but none of them connect. And this is not just a southern phenomena. In the north, you can see Boston had numerous railroads, none of them connected. And even Philadelphia, where the Union League is, there were several railroads that came in. There does appear to be a connection over by the other side of the river by Market Street, where the Pennsylvania Railroad Yard was, but I'm not sure if they shared a Union Station or not. So Alexandria was another example of a town where the railroads did not connect. There were 3 railroads that came in. And Alexandria was occupied by the Union on the second day of the Civil War. In fact, the first casualties of the Civil War happened at the Marshall House, which is shown in the middle of that chart. But one of the things the Union did was they connected all of these disparate stations with track, and those are shown in red in this diagram. And they operated as one big railroad, which made it much more efficient. And actually those tracks survived and remained in place after the war. Now, Alexandria, we're lucky that we have several photographs of Alexandria because Herman Hopp, who was in charge of the railroads in Virginia at the time, hired photographers to take pictures of the railroads because he knew what they were doing was important and he was proud of what they were doing. And so as a result, we see lots of good pictures of the railroads in Alexandria. This is the roundhouse that's over by Duke Street now. Well, it was, it's all gone now. And then if you go up on the roof of that cupola and look west, this is the view you would have. And one thing to note is if you come to Alexandria now, you'll see that there are trees everywhere. But back then, the trees were largely gone. This is the other station in Alexandria. This is the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire station. You can see railroad cars in the lower right, and there's a stockade fence on the left to protect it against cavalry raiders. And way off in the distance, you see a flat ground, and that's where I happen to live now. Also, that is not a radio antenna on top of the station. That is a flagpole. Atlanta was one of the exceptions about railroads not connecting and not interchanging. 3 railroads came into Atlanta and their tracks all connected to the same station. And recently I have read that there was some interchange of cars among those railroads, although it wasn't that common. So I went through the atlas of the Civil War, the official records atlas, and just graphically looked at which ones had non-rail-to-rail interchanges and which ones did. And this is what I came up with. And on the right, you see a picture of Washington, D.C. So the B&O Railroad comes in from the upper left, and it did not connect to Virginia across the Long Bridge. The U.S. Military Railroad built that connection and ran trains across that. And in fact, this picture shows railroad cars parked on the Maryland Avenue Depot using that connection I just described, because there was a word that there would be a raid on the Alexandria facility. And so the U.S. Military Railroad moved their equipment over to Washington for safekeeping. The raid never did materialize. And unfortunately, the Capitol in this picture is not very visible. So what were railroads doing? And everyone tends to focus on the tactical value of the railroads. They're familiar with this picture of the Dictator mortar or even the rail guns that were used. And for many years, the archives had this picture in the lower left of a rail gun, and it had a quote that it was a Union gun used in Petersburg. Well, it turns out recent research by Dr. Schneider in New Jersey has shown that this was actually the first railroad gun ever built. It was specified by Robert E. Lee and built by a man named Brooke, who was the same engineer who built the Monitor the Merrimack/Virginia ironclad. And it was used, this particular gun was used in one battle. It was not very effective. The Confederates parked it on a siding down by Petersburg and never used it again. And that, therefore, when it was found by the Union soldiers, that's when the picture was taken. The B&O Railroad did build some armored cars with a small field gun in them, and also wood armored cars for infantry that would be used behind them. And they saw action, and 2 of them were allegedly destroyed. There are no photos of this gun. And so I worked with the curator at the B&O Museum to build this model for them. And this is now in their permanent collection. And we just basically had to use textual descriptions and some engineering on how much weight a train could carry and so on to figure that out. So if railroads were not involved in the actual fighting, at least not very much, what were they doing? Well, they were doing strategic transport, which means moving the soldiers and equipment long distances, and they were moving the logistics, providing the supplies. And this particular chart shows an example of a strategic movement that was done by railroads. So let's set the stage. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee retreats to Virginia, and General Meade with the Army of the Potomac follows him. Neither army is strong enough to take on the other decisively. So General Lee looks at the situation and says, we have a stalemate in Virginia, but we're losing the war in the West. So Longstreet, take your 12,000 men. I'll also get your reinforcements from Jackson, Mississippi, and some other places. Go to Georgia and help Bragg defeat Rosecrans. And so Longstreet shows up just in time for the Battle of Chickamauga, which is a Confederate victory. The Union Army retreats to Chattanooga and is besieged. It's in trouble because their supply lines are cut off. So back in Washington, Lincoln and Stanton and others get together and decide that they need to send reinforcements to Rosecrans. And so they use their railroad assets to move 25,000 men. And it took really only 11 days to get there, but it was 15 calendar days because Morgan launched a cavalry raid up from Alabama into Kentucky. And so the soldiers that were on the rail cars stopped. They guarded the railroad facilities while Morgan was running around. And as soon as he retreated back, they continued their move. But more importantly, Sherman and Grant came over from Mississippi. Sherman marched by land with his army. He almost got captured on this march, by the way. And Grant went all the way up to Illinois and came back down into Chattanooga. And with the reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac, they immediately broke the siege, had the Battle of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, both Union victories. Grant gets promoted, takes over command of the whole Union Army, and Sherman does his Atlantic campaign and march to the sea. So basically the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. In terms of logistics, this is what a typical railroad would be hauling. This is the U.S. Military Railroad Aquia line, which is the line that I modeled. So it's supporting about 100 to 110,000 men and 60,000 animals. All of the supply comes in by ship and then is put on train and sent out. On a typical day, this is what they would haul. Notice that the predominant cargo is forage, which is the feed for the animals. So the 60,000 animals eat way more than the 100,000 men. The food is the commissary stores. Quartermaster stores are uniforms, tents, stoves, weapons, things like that. At this time, the Union Army was camped out in winter quarters. They were not actively campaigning. And so many people went back on leave. There are also examples of mail and packages going back and forth. And the railroad was shipping supplies because the railroad was preparing for its march on Richmond, and they were prefabricating bridges and stockpiling equipment for that. And there was also ammunition being shipped because soldiers were firing ammunition for training and other missions like that. This is what a typical supply depot would look like in 1862. It wasn't very fancy. You just pulled your railroad cars up, opened the doors, pulled wagons up and started unloading. And remember, in this time period, once you got off a train or a ship, to move something any further took muscle power. It was either going to be human power or horsepower or oxen power. By 1865, Union supply depots have become quite elaborate. In fact, the Union Supply Depot at City Point becomes the busiest port in America at this time. And it had over a mile of wharfs, and the wharfs were all specialized. There was a forage wharf, a coal wharf, an ammo wharf. There were hospitals, bakeries, sawmills, all kinds of facilities at this port. There was also a car ferry, and this is the first example of a railroad car ferry ever. It was invented by Herman Hopt to take railroad cars from Alexandria, Virginia to Aquia Landing. And then later, they also used this to ship railroad cars to other locations. To build the floats, they took Schuylkill barges from the Philadelphia area, lashed them together, and put the railroad cars on them longitudinally, laterally, not longitudinally. Later, they would figure out it'd be quicker if they did it longitudinally. But Herman Hopt wrote what we would now call a cost-benefit analysis of this operation. It's available at the National Archives. And in it, he claims it saved money, and also that they could unload that float in about an hour. And you can see if you have a ramp of 2 or 3 ramps, then you would have to move the float each time you want to unload cars. But they were able to do it fairly quickly. This is the other end of that car ferry operation on the Aquia Landing. And this is the scene that I model on my railroad. You'll note it's 2 tracks, but we have no picture that shows the ramp up close to see what the ramp looked like. And Aquia Landing was another busy port. There's some scenes. And the thing to remember here is how many people are standing around, because it goes back to my comment about muscle power. You need a lot of people to move the supplies around. Now, people are interested in rolling stock modeler, railroaders, and rail fans like to look at freight cars. And one of the things about the Civil War is that you did not have the variety and types of cars that you do now. There were no tank cars, there were no intermodal double stack cars. Basically, you had box cars and flat cars and some gondolas. But the box cars themselves were all quite different. And if you look at this picture, you can see that except for maybe the second and third car back, they're all slightly different. And in fact, number 478 in the foreground is what they call a combination car, which had iron bars on one door or a solid side. So you could flip it if you're doing livestock, or if you needed something that was protected by the weather, you could use the other door. So an interesting style of car. There's also cars for the Adams Express Company. Now, the Adams Express Company was kind of like our FedEx today. By the way, Adams Express still exists as a financial services company. They no longer do packages. But if you were a soldier, north or south in the Civil War, the chances were good that you wanted to send some of your salary home so that your family had money. You could not use the post office because the post office would not guarantee the money. So to do this without fear of losing it, you would take your money to the Adams Express office. They would write a receipt, and they would either telegraph it or literally carry the money up north and give it to your family members minus their commission. And I did find in a New York newspaper an ad from the Adams Express Company advertising services on my railroad. And I do have some records that show that there was an Adams Express car on my railroad. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We have passenger cars in the Civil War. And in fact, this particular passenger car may be considered the first Air Force One, because this car was developed for Lincoln to when he visited the troops at City Point. Abraham Lincoln loved getting away from Washington. Who wouldn't? And he loved visiting the soldiers. And he went to City Point several times. He also visited the Aquia Line 4 times. This car was allegedly lined with lead to offer a level of protection from bullets. However, they were building, the U.S. Military Railroad was building a car for Abraham Lincoln in its shops in Alexandria. And you can see the car in the background there. Lincoln did not like this car. He thought it was too fancy for him. He preferred something more, less fancy. So the only time Lincoln ever got to ride in that car was when he was on his funeral train. So they decorated the train with bunting, and they hauled he and his son back to Springfield, Illinois, on a long circuitous route across the north so that the people could pay their last respects. And this particular photo is a model that I built for the B&O Museum of that car, because the funeral car itself did go through the Baltimore. It's in their permanent collection now. Now, in terms of locomotives, I tell people you can have whatever locomotive you want as long as it's a 440. That's not entirely true, but it's largely true. At least 90% of the engines back then were the 440 style. And if you're not familiar with that nomenclature, it describes the number of axles that the locomotive had. So in this case, there are 4 wheels in the front, 2 axles for the pilot truck, and then 4 wheels for the driving axles, and there's no trailing truck, so that would be the O, so 440. Also notice how ornate and pretty locomotives were back then. They were highly decorated. Now here's an example of a 460, which was used by the B&O, and the B&O and the Pennsy Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, were the 2 that had probably the largest variety and types of locomotives. Most of the other railroads had only 440s, but the B&O had, and the Pennsy had mud diggers and 280s and 080s and a couple other styles of locomotives. So in terms of infrastructure, These are some of the things I'd like to cover, but we don't have time to get into all of them in great detail. I've already mentioned the steam engines. Another thing to remember is that rail back then was largely iron, was not steel. There were some steel rails that were imported from England. The B&O used some. They were stolen by the Confederates, and the Confederates used them to build a temporary line from Manassas Junction to Centerville. And the B&O got those rails back at the end of the war and reused them. But for the most part, they were iron rails. Steel had to be made by hand in the puddling process, so about 40 pounds at a time. So steel was reserved for tools and weapons, medical instruments. It wasn't used in industrial quantities like it is now. In fact, it wasn't until 1865 when the Bessemer process was developed in England and brought over to the US in 66 that you start to get steel in industrial quantities. Another thing is a stub switch. I'll show you an example in a little bit. I won't talk about it now. I'll talk about the telegraph a little bit. The Lincoln pin couplers was the style of coupler used on trains back then. They were very simple, but they were also extremely dangerous. You could lose your fingers and you could be crushed because the operator had to get between the cars to do it. And those were outlawed in 1870. They were 70s. They were replaced, incidentally, by a man who lived in Alexandria. His name was Janey. He came up with the Janey coupler, and there's a street in Alexandria named after him. Another oddball thing is that you only had handbrakes on one truck. Hospital cars were developed. The surgeons of the military realized that their patients would heal better if they had better care in their hospital cars. So at the start of the war, cars that were just a box car would be spread with hay, and that would be considered an ambulance. So when you look at medical records, you see fresh straw was considered a medical supply. But later they came up with hospital cars that had suspended bunks and water service, an attendant, and a stove to keep the men warm. I mentioned car ferries earlier. It was the first car ferry ever. We do have some good photos of the Civil War, but to put in perspective, the number is pretty small. We have 6,000 photos in the Library of Congress and the National Archives. In World War I, there I believe are 600,000, and in World War II, there's 6 million. So quite a few more in later conflicts. And I'll talk a little bit about replacement bridge building in a minute. So what is a stub switch? If you're familiar with railroads now, they have what they call a blade switch. And the stub switch was simpler to build. It did take more maintenance, but its main drawback was if you approach a stub switch from the wrong direction, the way it wasn't set, you will derail. It's set up like a current derail. And so as a result, there was an accident. There were many accidents, but there was an accident in the 1870s in Colorado where 60 people were killed on a passenger train. And after that, Congress outlawed stub switches on the main line. They were used on branch lines and some other places, but on the main line or anywhere you could see a passenger train, they were outlawed. Another interesting thing about the Civil War, because steel and iron was somewhat of a rare substance, everything was made out of wood. So here we see a large bridge across the Cumberland River made out of wood and stone. But the remarkable thing about this bridge is the center span swings to allow steamboats to go by. And there's actually a telegraph line that goes across on that aerial on the top of the spans. And there were some really big bridges at this time made with stone and wood. And this particular bridge is near Farmville, Virginia, which is near Appomattox. And the Confederates burned this bridge as they were retreating toward Appomattox. And the U.S. Military Railroad rebuilt it as a trestle. The original trusses are on the right. In terms of operations, this was the early examples of what they call train order and timetable operations. So trains operated on a strict timetable with certain rules. The rule book back then was fairly short. It was only 10 pages roughly. The U.S. Military Railroad rule book was only 10. And nowadays the rule book's about 250 pages. And every additional rule was added as a result of an accident. And so we sometimes call that the book written in blood, because each rule was to prevent an accident that happened. And speaking of accidents, you did have military interference, which caused accidents. The best example is when Stonewall Jackson is ordered to Richmond from the Valley to reinforce Robert E. Lee. He was notorious for not telling his men what was going on. He just told his men, move to Richmond minutes or hours. And so a colonel gets on a train and he takes two armed men and he gets in the locomotive and he points these weapons at the locomotive engineer and he says, "You will not stop for anything. We need to get to Richmond." Now the engineer looks at these guys and says, "Okay." He doesn't say anything. He just starts the train. He knows he's going to have to meet a train at Hanover. And about 5 minutes before or a few minutes before the crash, he looks at his watch. He jumps off the cab. It's night. He runs away. He's never seen again. And the two engines collide and there are fatalities. Now it's an example of how things don't change. The newspapers report that a civilian woman and her baby were killed in the wreck. But if you read some memoirs, in particular Train Running for the Confederacy, you find out that 60 soldiers were also killed. Now, why would a colonel do this? You say, why would he interfere? Well, alcoholism was a big problem in this period, particularly with workers in industries and stuff, because the jobs are terrible. They were hard and they were long, so people tended to drink. As a result, railroad engineers had a very poor reputation among the military guys. And so the officer just did not trust that engineer and he interfered. A week after this accident happened, the Confederate government issued a decree that the military would not interfere with the running of trains. The United States military had already done that a little while previous. Telegraph, I'll talk about that in a little bit. I mentioned the fact that during winter quarters, we ran the railroad like a regular railroad, but when active campaigning started, because of guerrilla action and other problems, they tended to convoy their trains. And I won't mention the Great Chase because everyone knows about that, except for to point out that the first medals of honor were issued to the Union, the Northern participants in that operation. So here's Herman Hopp. He was a member of the Union League. He was a West Point graduate. He was so small when he went to West Point. He was 14 years old that he could not hold an actual rifle. So they gave him a piece of wood to use as a rifle. And after he left West Point, he became a civilian. He worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad. He built bridges. He designed a lot of the tracks. He wrote a textbook at age 30 or so on how to build bridges. And when the war broke out, he was in Massachusetts building the Hoosick Tunnel. And Stanton knew that he was a, quote, railroad genius and brought him and asked him to come down. Now, he was a brilliant man, but he was a little prickly. And he had some problems. He ended up being forced out. Although he did make it to brigadier general, he never officially accepted the commission because he needed the ability to tend to his personal affairs, largely the Hoosick Tunnel. But anyway, he developed these procedures, principles for running trains. And if you look at the third one down, that was a really important one. And everyone has heard about the Red Ball Express in World War II and how Patton's army had to stop moving because they ran out of supplies. Well, the reason was the quartermaster in World War II was not obeying Hopp's third point. They were using the boxcars as warehouses to store the equipment that was moving forward. As a result, there were insufficient boxcars to move stuff. So supplies were being stockpiled on the ports and not getting to the soldiers. So I say, Patton, you should have read Hopp's book, not Rommel's book. In terms of operation, the telegraph was key. And here we see 3 Pennsylvania Railroad individuals who were instrumental in setting up the U.S. military telegraph service. You have Scott on the left, Carnegie in the middle, and forgot his name. He wrote a book about telegraphs at the White House. I'll think of his name in a second. Homer something or other. I'm sorry, I forget. Anyway, by the way, I highly recommend that book. It's available for free online. And if you read that book, you see, again, going back to my point about how little changes in Washington. But Lincoln heavily relied on the telegraph to keep up on what was going on. And the telegraph played a very important role. However, the railroad, once the campaigning started, had trouble getting time on the telegraph because the military was using it for everything else. And so as a result, that's why they resorted to running in convoys. And by the way, the picture on the bottom is what a mobile telegraph station would look like. By 1864, They got so good that they could run about 2 miles an hour of telegraph line. And during Grant's overland campaign, as he was trying to take Richmond, he actually had telegraph communication with his corps commanders, which is remarkable if you think about it, because prior to any other war before that, everything had to be done by courier and messengers. One of the things that I find fascinating is that a lot of the paperwork from the U.S. military railroad survived and is at the National Archives. And these are photos of documents I copied, the telegraph train orders for my railroad, conductor's reports for trains. I could, if I wanted to, run an actual replica of what they ran on my railroad. I even have a copy of their rule book. Another thing to point out is that railroads proved very hard to destroy permanently. And this continued all the way up to World War II and even Vietnam, when we had trouble taking out the railroad bridges. And, you know, we all have heard about Sherman's bow ties, and that was where they would take a rail and wrap it around a tree. But if you did that, you did not permanently take that rail out of service. They could cut the tree down and they could take that rail and heat it up and rebend it. To really destroy a rail, you needed to twist it. And this guy over here, Smead, who worked in Alexandria, he worked for Herman Hopp. And Hopp says in his memoirs that Smead is the single person who is most responsible for Sherman's victory and therefore ending the war, because Smead kept the railroad to Sherman running. But Smead came up with these little hooks. So you would, if you were a cavalryman or an infantryman, you would carry these little metal hooks in your backpack. You would get to a railroad, you find the log, and the picture up north on the top is the men in Alexandria bending a rail to test them. And then the bottom picture, you see Sherman soldiers in Atlanta using those hooks to twist the rail. And once the rail is twisted, there was no way you could bend it, straighten it out by just dropping it. And that rail had to go back and be re-rolled. And so when Sherman wanted to destroy a rail line, he would park an infantry division for a day on that rail line. They would dig up every tie and burn them. They would twist and bend every rail. And they would also take the fill and move it back to the cuts so that it would take huge manpower to rebuild those lines. And that's what he did to the railroads in Georgia. They were totally destroyed by the time he was done with it. So in summary, here's what I've talked about. Gave a little review of what the North and South looked like at the start of the war. We talked about the roles that the railroads played, some of the logistics, equipment, infrastructure. And if we have time now, I'd like to show you some model photos of my railroad. So this is the front room of my railroad. And these are just various scenes. This is the little town of Falmouth. I have an engine terminal there, which is based after the turntable at Manassas. Here we see a scene of a train passing a picket camp, which is essentially guard duty, soldiers guarding. In this case, they're guarding this bridge. And here we see an old 1840 style engine crossing the bridge. I love this engine, but it really can't pull very much. It's a very small locomotive. Here's an example of what a stub switch looks like with a switch stand. Potomac Creek was a scene of several big bridges. There were at least 4 bridges there during the war. This is the one I modeled, which is a truss bridge. I have scenes showing the African Americans who worked for the U.S. Military Railroad Construction Corps. There were about 300 men who worked on this. Some of them were escaped slaves, some of them were carpenters, and a few engineers, and those men did amazing work. It's just incredible what they could do. Just another scene of Potomac Creek on my railroad. This is all based on, I only have one photo of this area, so it's all based on photos. One of my favorite scenes on the railroad is the trains cutting through, running through the country. I put this watermill on my railroad because I like the watermill. It's actually located in Fairfax County, which is about 30 miles from my house. The building is still standing minus the wheel. And if you go inside, which I haven't because it's on private property, but inside there's graffiti carved on the beams from Civil War soldiers, both North and South, who stayed in that building. And here we see, we know that the U.S. Military Railroad had a sawmill, but we don't know where. So I put it at Brooke because I had a flat spot for it. And here we see a train running into Brooke. Now, this man named Gordon at the storage building, he was interesting because he lived in Falmouth, Virginia, and he had a warehouse there. He was the first commercial millionaire in the United States. So all the other millionaires before him, George Washington, who's one of the wealthiest men and the wealthiest presidents ever, they all made their money from land. Gordon was the first guy who made $1 million through trading tobacco and cotton. This is a scene on the new part of my railroad. I'll be expanding it some more as the years go by. And finally, a little plug, if any of this has caught your interest and you want to learn a little more, I have a book out called Model Railroads Go to War. It's available on Amazon and on my website and other places. And if you would like more information, there's my blog. And also I have a small company that sells model railroad related items. So with that, that concludes my talk. And if we have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay.
Bernie, thank you so much. That was incredible. And as a former model railroader, folks, what you just saw, that level of detail on those model railroads was just breathtaking. So what is the scale of the models you showed?
O scale, 1 to 48.
No kidding, used O scale, all right.
So a figure is about that high.
Okay, all righty. And another question was, what speeds were achieved in the Great Locomotive Chase?
Not that fast, really. The engines could top out around 60 miles an hour, and they may have gone a little bit, but they had to frequently stop to get wood and to cut their telegraph lines, so they didn't move that quickly.
Okay, that certainly makes some sense. I think some questions were already answered during your talk. Dick Wills asked about why Meigs didn't accept his promotion. We heard about that. There was a question about Baldwin locomotives. And for people who don't understand or don't know much about Philadelphia at the time of the Civil War, Philadelphia was the major and largest industrial manufacturing city in America. It had two major railroads, the Pennsylvania, but even more importantly, the Philadelphia and Reading, which was the bigger of the two at the time. The presidents of both the Philadelphia and Reading and the Pennsylvania were members of the Union League. Actually, they were founding members of the Union League and stayed members during the war itself until afterwards. Matthias Baldwin from Baldwin Locomotive Works was also a founding member of the League, as was John Felton Morris with the Philadelphia Wilmington Baltimore Railroad at the same time. So lots of good Philadelphia Railroad connections. So let's go to Baldwin. So Bernie, how of all the engines that were made for the USMRR, how many were made by Baldwin? I don't know if you know that actually, but maybe even a rough guess.
Good question. Somehow around 200 rings a bell. Okay. However, the U.S. Metro Railroad ordered engines from all the manufacturers. They got them from all of them. But Baldwin was a biggie. In fact, Baldwin had a locomotive on my railroad called the Washington, but it was a really early one called the flexible beam locomotive. And by the time Hop got it, didn't run that well. And so when it came time to test the strength of the bridge, he said, let's run the Washington out, and if it falls in the river, nobody will care. But Baldwin made some good locomotives. Baldwin was an interesting guy. I mean, very strong abolitionist, and was one of the first folks to hire blacks to work in his factory.
Yes.
So he's a good guy.
He was very much ahead of the curve, so to speak. So,
yeah.
All right. We have a request for you to put up your book title and website info again, if you would be willing to do that.
All right, let's see. I have to share my screen again, right?
Share screen. Yep, you do.
Oops, wait a minute. There we go. And I click on that. Okay. Is that good like that, or do you want it bigger?
I think that'll work for right now. So
okay, good. We'll leave it just like that.
I was going to suggest, great, that's wonderful. So, all right. Question, lifetime of iron versus steel rails.
The iron rail wore out much quicker, and depending on the use, it's hard to say. Also, a thing I didn't talk about was before the war, a lot of the rail wasn't even rail. It was just strap. It was just pieces of iron on wood or even on a stone, and those wore out much quicker. I'm going to have to refrain from giving a number because it's highly variable, but the steel rail lasted a lot longer. In fact, look, those rails that the B&O had that stole, they picked them up and reused them. So that's how good they were.
Okay.
Rail came in 28-foot lengths, by the way, back then, and the connectors were made out of wooden blocks. So it was kind of dicey, needed a lot of maintenance.
Well, you're not kidding. Wow. I didn't know that. It's amazing it's stuck together, stay together. All right. What training existed for conductors back then?
Well, a lot of the conductors for the U.S. Military Railroad came from the railroads that they, worked on before that. But basically, it was OJT. You were taught. You started probably as a brakeman, and if you survived that, then you learned enough to become a conductor.
Makes sense. Sure.
The conductor is the guy who runs a train. By the way, there's a really good book called Southern Railroad Man. His name is Bell, is the writer. He was a conductor, and it starts in the Civil War, and then you can follow him through to about 1920s. And the thing that I found amazing about that book was, as a conductor, even in peacetime, at least one person a year died on one of his trains. It's just a dangerous time, and a lot of the people were basically drunks that fell off the trains. But there were other incidents that he talks about in his book. So highly recommend that if you want to learn more about railroad conductors early on.
Okay, good. Another question. Did coal fuel exist in the 1860s? How much more efficient, if so?
Yes, there was coal, but most railroads used wood. The B&O was one of the few that did have coal because they had lines that went up to the coal fields, and they did have coal burning engines. And at one point, they lent 2 coal burning engines to the U.S. Military Railroad, and as a result, they had to get coal down to Alexandria to provide those engines with fuel. And so, there were coal, but mostly wood. And then actually out west, you started to see some coal burning engines. Forget which way it went, either the UP or the one of them, mostly coal, because they didn't have enough woods in the areas that they were traveling.
Mm-hmm.
So there were coal engines.
Okay, all right. What are the best locations, museums, collections, whatever, to see Civil War era locomotive and rolling stock or replicas or remaining infrastructure?
I think number one is the B&O Museum. Mm-hmm. The Pennsylvania Railroad Museum, that's in Baltimore.
Right.
That's in Baltimore. They have amazing collection of even the roundhouse is Civil War era. Mm-hmm. It was damaged, but it was rebuilt. The museum, the Strasbourg Museum, has some really old Civil War era stuff. And then the Southern Museum of Railroad, something or other, in Big Shanty, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. They have some interesting locomotives there, including, I believe they have a piece of the old General. And the Texas was located in Alexandria. That was a locomotive from the Chase, but they recently moved and rebuilt it. I'm not sure where it is. But those are the 3 I would recommend for Civil War era museums.
Great, thanks for that. All right, we've run out of questions and we've just about run out of time, but I would just kind of reinforce the fact that, Philadelphia was absolutely integral to the success of the USMRR, both in terms of the expertise from the executives that were used, like Haupt and Colonel Tom Scott from the Pennsylvania Railroad, who was the number 2 guy running the USMRR, for instance, to the manufacturers. And it wasn't just Baldwin, there were many others at the same time. And Philadelphia just did a lot to help the military railroad during the war itself. So okay. All right. Hey, Bert, I don't know about anybody else, but you could have gone on for 2 more hours and I'd still be listening. I mean that sincerely. And we didn't even touch the military aspects of what the railroad did, like moving troops from point A to point B, using successfully on interior lines versus exterior lines, all that kind of stuff. I found this one just absolutely fascinating. So
you could do a whole hour just on the telegraph.
Oh, absolutely. They just published a book about Lincoln and the telegraph. So there's a book about it. You can speak an hour about it at least. So
Homer Bates. Read Homer Bates's book. I just remembered his name. He was a Pennsy guy too, by the way.
There you go. Never. So all right. Fantastic, Bernie. So maybe
thank you.
we'll have you back for part 2 perhaps sometime, maybe next year, and maybe we'll put together a road trip and come down. And I'm just kidding. We wouldn't dare impose on your railroad, but it looks
Oh,
fascinating.
no, come on down. I tell people I have the #2 tourist attraction in Alexandria.
Yeah. You probably do. All right.
I have visitors from all over the world come down here. I love them. What,
We'll be down then. All right, but not until
show off.
just so everybody knows, Bernie very kindly put off his hip replacement surgery until tomorrow so we can give the talk tonight.
Ah!
So we're going to wait for Bernie's surgery until we go down and bother him and look at his railroad. So Bernie, thank you. That was just,
Thank you.
it was really a lot of fun. So thank you very much, and good luck tomorrow. All right.
All right, thank you.
It all goes well. So folks, you saw the slide earlier. The next program is the Public Affairs program on September the 2nd, featuring a Union League member, all right, who happens to be the chairman and CEO of Johnson & Johnson, Alex Gorski. So you can imagine what the subject of that will be, given what's going on in the world right now. And then after that, on September 26th, we have the next Civil Roundtable, and it will be about Antietam, the single black American military history, September 17th of 1862. But this one specifically will deal with the cornfield, which within an hour, the cornfield had been cut down to maybe an inch above ground. That's how intense the fighting was there. So 2 really good, wonderful programs coming up. So thank you once again, everybody, Union League members and others, for joining us this evening. It was really fascinating. We're almost up to Labor Day, so everybody have a good holiday weekend when it happens, and we will see you when we see you. So Bernie, thanks again. And League members, stay well, stay safe, and be careful out there.